Good evening and welcome to Undercover. This is the show that takes a look between the covers of books by Missoula and Western Montana area authors. My name's Dave Pauli. I'm the director of the Missoula Public Library and the host of this show, which is jointly produced by the Missoula Public Library and Fact and Fiction Bookstore. Well, you know, we've been on the air long enough now that we're starting to have authors showing up for their second show, and it's really a wonderful thing to see people coming back and talking about new books that they've written. And our guest today is Dorothy Patent. Welcome, Dorothy.
Nice to be here.
This is your second appearance, and we're happy to have you back again, as I mentioned. And Dorothy is an author of some renown. I think she's probably one of the more well-known authors that we have living in the Missoula area. Has written many books for children, mostly nonfiction books for children, but also other kinds of books. Last time we interviewed you, it was about a gardening book that was for adults. But I just wonder if you can tell us how many books you've written, since I see, when I look in the library catalog, I see a huge list of books with your name as the author. So.
Well, I guess it's close to 80 now. I've been doing this for a little over 20 years, and I don't know that they're 80 in print yet, but there are always several that are on the way.
Mm-hmm. And so you and I were chatting before the show about some of the books that have been in development for a while, but what's the average time it takes you to complete a book?
Well, that's really hard to say. When you contract with a publisher, usually the publisher gives you about a year to a year and a half to finish the book. But oftentimes I've done research for the book before that even happens, because I've come up with the idea because I've become familiar with the subject matter. Mm-hmm. So I may have done quite a bit of the work already for that particular book. And then it takes another year after you finish the book before it actually is published, or longer sometimes than a year.
Why is that?
Well, there's a lot of things that go into publishing a book. Once it's written, you have to have, the editor has to read it and make editorial remarks about it, you know, ways of improving the manuscript and so forth, and then the author reviews those, and they go back, and then the book is set in type, and there's galley proofs to go through. The book has to be designed, where the photographs are going to go, and what kind of type is going to be used. Jacket has to be designed. All these things take a lot of time at the other end, and the author is not involved with those areas except to check things over once in a while along the way. But it just takes a long time to go from manuscript to book.
Well, one of your newest books which I just got through taking a look at it, if we can get a shot of that, is called Ospreys. And what a wonderful book with beautiful photographs of birds, ospreys in flight and nesting and other kinds of activities. And your collaborator, William Munoz, evidently has been with you quite a while, and you've worked together on a number of books, I guess.
Yeah, we've been working together for 10 or 12 years, and he doesn't illustrate all of my books, but all the books that we do on, I do on topics that can be researched in Montana and sometimes in other areas. If it's a book about one kind of animal, he and I will usually collaborate. If it's an animal that, you know, is easy to either easy to photograph or that lives around here. Every once in a while I work with other photographers. For example, a book I have that just came out this fall called Looking at Penguins is illustrated by an Australian fellow who does research in Antarctica, because penguins are really hard birds to photograph. You can't just, you know, say, well, I'm going to go out and photograph, you know, get enough photographs for a book on penguins. You have to have somebody who's been working in the area for many years.
Were some of these osprey photos taken locally?
Most of them were.
Most of them were, yeah.
Right, and Bill got the cooperation of the power company up in the valley. He lives in St. Ignatius, and some of these photos were taken from up high on one of those, you know, those gadgets that they send up really high where you can sit up at the top, and they work on the power lines, and they were having to remove some sticks on the osprey nest that were interfering with the power lines, and they took him up with them.
Yeah.
So he was able to get photos of eggs in the nest and things that you would not normally be able to do.
Well, I wonder how the process works as far as developing or coming up with an idea for a book. Now, you're writing informational books aimed at a certain age group, but how do you decide, well, I'd like to do a book on ospreys or penguins or so many of the other things that you've done?
Well, there are different ways it can happen. Sometimes, like looking at penguins was suggested by my editor at Holiday House. Normally, either I come up with the idea or Bill comes up with the idea, and a lot of times one book will evolve from another. For example, we did a book on wolves called Gray Wolf, Red Wolf, and then I received a letter from a publisher who was interested in doing a series of books on animal behavior, comparing domesticated animals with wild animals, and wanted to know if I was interested in that. And immediately I thought, well, dogs and wolves. And so that was the origin of this book, Dogs, the Wolf Within, which is about dog behavior and how you can see a lot of what wolves do in what dogs do. So that's a lot of times one book will evolve from another. I've done several books on different kinds of whales, for example, starting with the general book for older children, and then a general book for younger children, then a book on humpback whales, and a book on killer whales.
Okay. Well, when you talk about different age groups, do you have a particular age group in mind for a particular book? Or, I mean, it seems to me like the material and the information could cut across a lot of age groups in many of the books.
Yeah, well, that's one of the advantages of writing for children, is that you can use the same information more than once by writing a book for, say, 2 different age levels. Like I have the book on whales for older children, and then a book on whales for younger children. It's shorter, it's simpler, the sentences are shorter, the paragraphs are shorter, the information is more general, and then again continuing, with books on individual species for even younger children. So if I just sit down and write, it usually ends up being a book for ages 10 and up. Somehow that's kind of my natural level. I write as if I'm talking to somebody who doesn't know anything about the subject matter. I don't specifically think about children as an audience, but if I write that way, it comes out about right for that age level. If I'm writing for younger children, I have to be more conscious as to words I use and things like that.
Well, how did all that get started? I mean, how did you start writing books for children? Where did that come from?
Well, I'm not one of these people who always wanted to be a writer. I've always loved animals, and I got a bachelor's degree in biological sciences, and then went on to get a master's and PhD in zoology from the University of California in Berkeley. And I met my husband and got married while I was in graduate school, and had 2 kids along the way. And so I wasn't sure what I was going to do with my degree. And after we'd traveled and worked in different places for a couple of years, we settled in North Carolina, and there was really nothing for me to do there. I'd been able to work part-time in laboratories until that time, and then I had to really sit down and think, well, what do I want to do with my time? My kids were 3 and 5 and at the time, and I didn't want to be out of the house. And so I sort of thought, well, I have kids. People have always said I explain things well. Maybe I should try writing books about animals for children, and it all just sort of fell together. It took a couple of years to get it going, but I feel really fortunate that I was able to get involved in it, because it's been the perfect job for me. Yeah.
Well, I didn't know you were a Berkeley grad. We'll have to do the secret handshake later on. I am too. Did you have difficulty initially figuring out how to get published, or who do you talk to, or how that all happens?
Well, I didn't stumble around as much as most people do. It's a really hard business to get into, because an author is a person who works solo, and it's really hard to find out how to go about it and how to contact publishers. And there are a lot of, I think, misapprehensions out there about what an author does and how do you go about writing a book and things like that. So what I did was to go to the library and pick out the kinds of books that were written for kids, and brought them home and read them to my children, and saw what kinds of publishers were doing these sorts of books. And at that time there was a book called a life cycle book, which is a very sort of a rigidly structured thing, where you started when the animal was born or hatched from an egg or whatever, until it matured and found a mate or died or whatever would complete a cycle. And then they were not very non-anthropomorphic books. And I thought, well, I can do this. And I thought a bumblebee is an animal that kids encounter that's really rather alarming and
Yeah.
obvious. So I wrote a manuscript about a bumblebee and sent it to Holiday House, which published a lot of those kinds of books. And the editor said, "We're not doing these books anymore, but I like your writing." And he apparently had another author who was a woman who, she had a master's degree and she was at home with kids, and it worked out really well with her to be an author. So he thought, well, maybe I found another person like that. And so I sent several ideas, and then they finally wrote me and asked me if I wanted to try doing a particular book. And if I did, if I sent them a sample chapter and outline, they liked it, they'd send me a contract. So I lucked out, really.
Well, have you been working basically with the same publisher?
Well, for about 10 years, I worked just with Holiday House, and I was doing 2 to 3 books a year. And then a number of things happened, and I was able to expand to work with other publishers, because you can't make a living on 2 to 3 books a year for children. They just don't sell that many copies. So I started writing for Clarion, which I've written lots of books for them, and I've been working with them ever since. And now I've published with about 10 different publishers altogether. But the ones I work with mostly are Holiday House and Clarion.
Well, what about, since you brought that up, what about the market for, I mean, I would guess, I don't know for sure, that schools and public libraries are a big part of the market for informational books like this.
Yeah, I don't know what the figures are now. A few years ago, it was 80% of the sales of these kinds of books are to libraries. However, there has been a big surge in children's bookstores around the country. There used to be maybe, I don't know, half a dozen in the whole country, and now I don't know how many there are, but they're over 100, and maybe 200, 300, I don't know. But it's a whole new field of publishing, and there's a lot more attempt to put bookstore appeal even into children's nonfiction now. And also there's, of course, a tremendous crisis in library funding. In California, they're closing school libraries.
I know.
And it's very sad, and so they certainly aren't buying books if they don't even have libraries anymore in schools. And so there has to be, I think the publishers are looking more to bookstores since libraries are having so much problems.
Yeah, well, we certainly find it important to have these kind of books available for kids. But one thing I've noticed is that you've done some things that aren't really mainstream topics. Now, there are lots of books on penguins, but you've done a book on cattle, for example, and that might be the only one we have in our library written for kids of this particular age on this subject. And you've also done a book, I know you did a book not too long ago on hunting. A Family Goes Hunting, I think was the title. And that's not the kind of a thing that is easy for us to find, so we're always happy to see something a little bit out of the norm. But how did you come to those particular topics, for example?
Well, the cattle book was it's part of the series the Carol Rhoda is putting out on their 4 books to start with. It's called Understanding Animals, and it was actually the concept an editor at Carol Rhoda developed the concept because she feels that kids need to respect animals, and by understanding them and how they behave and how their behavior relates to their wild relatives, that kids will have more respect for animals. So the first 4 books are dogs, cattle, and horses, which I have written. The horse book will be out soon, and then one on cats by another author. So that's how cattle came about. The hunting book came about because I basically got tired of the attitude that so many people who don't live in the West have about hunting, and as if everybody who hunts, has blood dripping from their fangs or something. And I know so many people in this area are hunters. I don't hunt myself. If life depended on it, I could. Otherwise, I don't find it something I want to do. But I understand why people do enjoy hunting, and I know it can be a really healthy family activity. So I just finally decided that somebody needed to write something about that for kids, and the editor at Clarion was brave enough, and it took courage, because it is a controversial subject. It took courage for them to agree to publish it. Well,
would I be correct in assuming that you're so well respected in this field that would have an influence on a publisher, that if someone else had submitted a similar book that was unknown, it might not have ever seen print?
Probably, yeah, I think so. And another thing it helped too is that the editor had just been to a conference in Pennsylvania, and one of the teacher or librarian came up to her and said, are you ever going to publish anything on hunting? Opening day, you know, none of the boys are in school. They all go hunting with their dads, and there's just nothing available for them. And it was right at the time when we had proposed this book. So she knew that there was a market for it and a need for it. But publishers don't like to get involved in controversy. I think especially children's book publishers, although it's gotten a lot better. There are topics that are discussed in books now that never were before.
Yes.
But I was lucky. The reviewer, we thought the reviewers might go bananas, you know, over this book, because most of them are centered in Manhattan and really don't know anything about the field. But there was only one review that we saw that was somewhat out of line. Most of them said this is a good book, and it talks about hunter safety, and you know, which is important, and shows hunting as a healthy family activity, which it does. So I was really delighted to see that the reviewers were able to set their own prejudices aside. In some cases, you could tell that she wasn't really comfortable with the book, but felt that, you know, an honest assessment was necessary.
Yeah. Well, that's really wonderful. I wonder if you want to make mention of the fact that since we've talked about how they're marketed, a number of your books have just been issued in paperback.
Yeah, and these books, one of the things that's frustrating about writing this kind of book for children is that they don't come out in paperback that often, and the hardback books are pretty expensive. They're like, you know, $12 to $20, which is a lot more than a lot of families can afford to spend on books for their children. And kids like animals. They don't just like storybooks, they also like animal books. So I was really glad to see that Clarion has put out several of my books in paperback. And there is another trend that I should have mentioned earlier for books in the classroom. More and more classroom teachers are buying books and putting them in the classroom, and that's one of the reasons for the increase in the paperbacks, because they can be bought and used. You know, a classroom, they can afford to buy several copies of the same book if they want.
Well, I'm all for that. More books to more kids, however they get them. I don't care.
Same here.
Do you ever get a chance to talk with kids about your writing and your books? I know
I sometimes, I usually do a couple of local schools a year, and then sometimes I'm invited to other places. I'm going to Florida in November, to Miami, and I'll be speaking in 2 schools there. And then every 2 or 3 years, there's a conference in Northern California in the Eureka area, which is a lot like Missoula. It's a rural area with a lot of kids tucked away in little towns in the mountains, and they bring in a whole bunch of authors from all over the country, and they try to get one author to each school in the area in the 3-day period. So I like going out there. What do
you find when you go talk to kids about? I guess just in general, how do they respond, and what do they think of your books, and are they different than they were a few years ago? That's a bunch of questions, but I guess basically, what do you find about kids?
Most kids really like animals. They are, at least the kids that I've met in the schools in these different areas have mostly responded very well. And the part they like best when I give a talk is the slide show. I usually bring a set of slides, some that I've taken, some that Bill has taken, and they really like hearing about bears and wolves, especially dramatic animals, and they really enjoy that part of things. So they're not that interested in what it's like to be an author and how a book is published. They're not as interested in that as they are actually in the material itself.
Do urban kids respond as well to the books about wildlife?
Well, ask me after I've done Miami.
Miami ought to be a good test of that, I guess.
Yeah, I haven't really spoken to kids in big cities before, and I hadn't even thought about that before you mentioned it. So it'll be interesting to see how they respond. I suspect that they, especially kids like third and fourth graders, in general, really, really like animals.
Well, I understand that there's a possibility you might be interested in doing a novel. Is that true? Or?
Well, I actually have a manuscript with an editor now for a fiction story. It's a wolf story, and it's something I've been working on in sort of my spare time, with that little that consists of, for the last year and a half, and I have no idea what she thinks of it, but several friends have read it. I belong to a local group of writers. We help each other out by critiquing things, and I don't bring my nonfiction to them, but I do bring my fiction because it doesn't come as naturally to me. And I also have a picture book I've been working on that I'm going to be sending to an editor. So I think it's fun to try different kinds of writing. But to date, everything I've published has been nonfiction. I'm hoping that will change in the next couple of years.
And it seems natural to, if you're going to be in fiction, to write an animal story, I would guess.
Well, that's what comes to my mind.
Well,
I'm pretty much an animal-oriented person. Even the picture book is about animals. So
yeah.
I don't think I could write a book that didn't have living, some kind of a biology focus, either animals as characters or being about the living world in some way.
Were you always interested, even as a child? Is that where this came from?
Yeah. Ever since as long as I can remember, when I was a kid, I'd go out in the woods and walk, and my brother and I would play with the toads. And I was kind of strange because I had snakes for pets, and girls aren't supposed to do that.
I'm glad you weren't my sister, but otherwise,
my parents were very tolerant
yeah.
of my hobby. I had
That's
a room
great.
full of cages and aquariums with fish and frogs and snakes and lizards and things, and sometimes they got loose, which didn't make people happy, but they put up with it. So
anything in development now that you could talk about? I know this is the newest one, and to me this is such an interesting thing because we don't probably have a book quite like this in any library that I know of. So called What Good is a Tale? Maybe you could talk about that for just a minute, how that book came about.
Well, that's a book that I suppose evolved through all the work that Bill and I have done together over time. It's the kind of thing that would be really hard to do if you hadn't had a lot of experience learning about different kinds of animals, and for Bill, going to zoos and in wild places, taking pictures of a lot of different kinds of animals, because you couldn't just go out and say, well, I'm going to do a book about tails. You'd have to already have a fairly good stock of information and photographs. But with that background, it was a relatively easy book to write. It was mainly a question of pulling out my knowledge from different areas, and it's a fun book.
Yeah.
To just think about that topic, and we're hoping to do more books like that for the same publisher. Although I think they want to see how this one does first. But there's so many, a lot of body parts.
Yeah.
You could write about. We'd like to do something about beaks and mouths in different ways and so forth. And we had a book on feathers, which has done really well, got a lot of really good reviews and so forth. And so we're working on one now on fur, which is a sequel, of course, to feathers, and it's going to talk about what fur does for mammals and what functions it has and so forth and so on. So that's a book that will be out next fall. I'm writing it now.
Oh, great. That just seems like such a nice original approach, and the kind of thing that we really need to have for kids. So.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of books about individual species now, and that's a trend in my writing, is going to be away from individual species, more towards general topics. I'm working on a book on biodiversity, which is a really big topic,
Yeah.
that I'm going to have finished this summer, so it won't be out until 1995. But that's going to be a larger book, larger format, longer, because it's a major topic. And we're hoping that it will become a basic reference book, so it's going to be a little bit different than the other things that I've done.
Yeah. So there's always something in the works with you, I guess.
Oh yeah, and you have to plan way ahead. I mean, I'm working on contracts that involve deadlines for 1995. And so I have to be really careful to schedule things so I don't get too many things going at once. That's a mistake I've made in the past. I'm trying not to make now.
Well, we certainly are glad to have you again as our guest on Undercover. And Dorothy Patent and William Munoz have done some wonderful books with great photographs and fascinating information I think really for people of all ages, but aimed at the children's market. Well, we have a couple of minutes left here. I want to tell everyone about upcoming events at the Missoula Public Library. November 15th through the 20th is Children's Book Week. And what a great combination that is, children and books, at least we think so. And in order to celebrate that week, we're going to have a little theme called Share the Adventure of Children's Book Week. First of all, on Monday, November 15th, we're going to have children's author Ben Mickelson. That's at 7 o'clock at the library. November 15th is a Monday. Wednesday, November 17th, we have a special program called Santa Calls. That'll be at 7 p.m. on Wednesday, 17th of November. Fact and Fiction bookstore owner Barbara Thoreau, who's one of the co-producers of this show, and our children's librarian Betty Ammon are going to provide information for parents about great books that make great gifts for kids. What a wonderful gift that is, too, around Christmas to give a child a book. Then on Saturday, November 20th, the library program for kids will center on books and dramatics. 3 age groups of children. We've got preschoolers through grade 1, grades 2 through 4, and 5th through middle school. And those kids will be planning, rehearsing, and performing short dramatic skits based on books. And children must be registered to participate in this. That's Saturday, November 20th, and so you need to call us at 721-2665 and ask for Karen or Betty if you want to get more information, if you'd like your child to be involved in some creative dramatics down at the library. Again, all those events take place November 15th through the 20th, which is National Children's Book Week, something that's celebrated all around the country, and especially by libraries and bookstores. Library hours are Monday through Thursday, 10 a.m. to 9 p.m., and Friday and Saturday, 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. Again, you can call us at 721-2665, 721-BOOK, if you're interested in any particular programs that we're doing. We also have an adult book discussion group which meets once a month on Thursdays at 7 o'clock, and we're interested in recruiting a few new people to be involved in that. That's a lot of fun, and we do a diverse selection of materials. We've done everything from Tennessee Williams plays to contemporary novels to classics. So, and we're looking for more people to be involved in that. And then finally, I'd like to mention that 1994 is a real special year for us at the Missoula Public Library, because that will be the year that we celebrate 100 years of library service in Missoula. And we're planning some special events. We want to focus on how libraries have changed and yet how they've remained the same and a central part of the cultural and intellectual life of this community in particular, but all communities across the country. So we'll be doing a number of things during 1994 to highlight our special centennial year. And one of the things we're going to be looking at is a fundraising drive. We don't often go to the community and ask for money in addition to our regular small levy that supports library service, but occasionally we do. And during 1994 we will be doing that because books and everything we buy have gotten a lot more expensive, and we are desperately trying to keep up with the demand for all kinds of material and all kinds of information that people need to get by in today's world. So you can expect to see the library asking you for a little bit of additional funding. Not a lot, but a little bit. And I think it's important to remember that you pay about $8 a year, citizens of Missoula County, for library service. You couldn't even buy a book for $8 nowadays, so keep that in mind. Again, thank you, Dorothy, for being our guest on Undercover.
Enjoyed it.